it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETchat. I'm really pleased today to have Ryan Leech on the line, who is a fellow podcaster also, a podcaster at the Bird Bath over in America in Dallas, but also a growth consultant. I've come across Ryan in a number of different places, which we'll no doubt talk about around digital innovation and so on. But first of all, Ryan, love the wallpaper.
Thank you. Yeah, it's for everyone just listening, I've got what's called Zebras in Love is the name of the wallpaper. You can get it at Target if you're in the US, and probably everywhere else on the internet. But yeah, it's a fun one. It's some zebras hugging and kissing and playing together and enjoying themselves.
And of course, great camouflage when they're out in the bush with their cryptic camouflage as well. So, but you're coming through loud and clear. Obviously, those people who aren't watching, you just have to imagine zebras.
Yep. And if you're imagining, you can imagine me in a safari outfit as well, if it makes the podcast more exciting for you.
And a pith helmet on.
Yeah, of course.
And of course, then we've got the podcast, which is called the Bird Bath Podcast. So it seems like you have a love of animals, Ryan.
I do. I'm, I've been in the animal health space, primarily in the vet care space for 7, almost 8 years now. And I always tell people I'm not a doctor. I'm just a startup guy with a love of technology. And beyond even just loving animals, I actually really enjoy working with veterinarians and the practitioners and clinics. I find the passion that drives our industry to be extremely refreshing, and very different from other verticals that I've worked in. So it's something that I've jumped in and embraced and learned as I've gone through.
Yeah, I think it is a very friendly profession, isn't it? I think people who work with animals often are pretty nice people themselves. So we've certainly found that when we chat to people who've come in from other industries, they find it a friendly industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely is. It's friendly. The thing I love about it, though, beyond just being friendly, is that it does try your mettle, right? You do need to be driven or desire to bring something to the space in order for people to feel like you're giving back to the industry versus it being just come in and take what you want and plunder the space and move out. So that's something I really enjoy about it too.
Yeah, I think it is most vets and most people in the industry are purpose centered, aren't they? There's a bigger goal there than just lucre or money or whatever.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Tell us a little bit about First 100 Consulting. What do you do with that?
Yeah, so the First 100 is my growth consulting business. I exclusively focus in the animal health space, primarily in vet care. I do some work on the pet care side of things if you branch out a bit, but what I like to do is work with earlier stage companies and companies that are trying to bring new products and new services to market. So I help them understand the nuances of the US veterinary market, and something that I know we've talked about off podcast before, but the nuanced differences between what you find in Europe or overseas, LATAM, Asia, all of those things don't always translate directly to the success that you'll find in the US market. And so trying to help people understand that piece of it, as well as I have a long background in sales and long time before video calls and telephone calls were the norm for most people. So I like to just guide new businesses into the space there as well.
I think the veterinary profession has been known to be quite conservative, a bit resistant to change. But I think really over the last 10 years, we've probably seen a change in that as young people come through who are more digitally native, digitally aware. Are you spotting that as well in America?
Definitely. I think we're still and it's a project that I'm actually working on, and hoping to launch and talk more about at the London Vet Show, which I will definitely see you at.
Yeah,
But it's I think what we have is we have a generation of new graduates that are coming out and new technicians that are entering the workforce that are very used to having their phone in their hand and working with technology and doing video calls and FaceTiming their family when they're off at college versus, needing to go and line up for the payphone at the end of the
yeah,
hall. But we still have the owners of the clinics as well as the heads of the corporate groups that own the practices that are from that previous generation. And so we have a demand from the workforce to adopt technology and move
yeah,
forward with it. But we have a resilience from the decision makers or the people signing the front of the checks to say that they want to bring that in. So I think we're going to start to see that as we see more younger entrepreneurial veterinarians enter the forces. And also as people just start to realize the ease of implementing technology in clinic is not the hurdle that it might have been when you had to buy new servers and implement,
yeah.
and have an IT guy come out and install updated software for you and things like that. So I think we're starting to slowly continue to turn the corner.
Yeah, I think that was and that was probably a big help for me when I set up Webinar Vet in 2010, when suddenly technology was allowing us to do things that we couldn't have done 5 years previously. And I suppose I just hit the sweet spot of being aware of the problem because I was a practicing vet, seeing that all the traditional CPD companies weren't really interested in technology,
Hmm.
and then coming across companies like GoToWebinar, the precursor to Zoom, who was offering technology at $99 a month for 1,000 people in a room that probably would have cost hundreds of thousands of pounds 10 years previously. So digitalization has democratized things. When I set up Webinar Vet, I set it up without really any capital, whereas my own practice, I'd moved up the road a year previously and spent hundreds of thousands of pounds getting that business relocated into new buildings, etc.
Yeah,
So setting up businesses now potentially I think has become more expensive because obviously tech is, getting a web developer and so on is more difficult. But it was like a sort of sweet spot then. But it's still a lot cheaper, I think, than running, a big bricks and mortars business.
I mean, I look at, it's a funny sort of meme online that people say podcast equipment should be more expensive.
Yeah,
And as
yeah,
two podcasters, maybe people go, "Yeah, I wish these guys had a bigger barrier to entry." But um, yeah, I mean, I set up. I had done a podcast previously called "Consolidate That," where we talked about consolidation in the veterinary industry, and then wanted to do a more news focused podcast with the Bird Bath. And I pay $19 a month for a hosting service that
yeah,
publishes everything. I have my editors who are still spectacular humans that do a ton of the work on the back end, but that plus a microphone I bought on Amazon and it can show up the next day, and you've got a podcasting business up and running.
yeah,
Squarespace website for $20 a month, maybe if you want to upgrade to the upgraded version, and it's yeah, you're up and running with a really great footprint that definitely was not attainable before when you had to rent
mm,
an office space and have physical presence and
yeah.
all of that.
It's also interesting. One of my good friends sadly passed away. Guy called John Tandy, who was a real innovator in the whole hospital space in the UK, had gone over to America and very graciously veterinary practitioners in America in the 60s and early 70s had opened their doors, let him see what they were getting on with. Obviously, America are ahead in a lot of areas. Do you think that gap is sort of narrowing now because of globalization? Because it's very easy for us to pop on a plane and get over to VMX or WVC. Um, is that sort of now, are we becoming a more homogenized, homogenized profession?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting when you when you look at that, obviously I was not in the industry or the world in the 60s or 70s. Um, I was still a twinkle in the eye, but I, I do think what we're finding is, and it's to take one step back. I find it interesting of your view of the U.S. sort of the layout of the practice and some of the medicine that's practiced, having been on the forefront of things. Whereas when I look at the direction that I expect to see the US veterinary market to head in, I actually look to the UK.
Yeah,
I think that the UK is about 8 years is kind of the rough estimate of what I look at is if you look at UK market 8 years ago, it's where the US is today.
yeah,
Um, and the actual industry I find is that way, but the practice of medicine is obviously different. But it is very it's you know we are on opposite sides of the world. We're looking at each other. We're having an open conversation. You
yeah,
could walk me downstairs. We could share a. I'll have coffee. You have tea, right? And we have a
yeah,
great time. And I think that really opens the door for a lot of increase of communication. I was talking with some people the other day who said, "Oh, I'm at the airport. I'm about to hop on a plane to China, but I'll shoot you a message in an hour when I get settled in on the flight."
yeah,
That's a very different world than 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
yeah. And the pace of change is quickening with technology. Obviously, both of us very interested in AI. That just becomes almost exponential with AI, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's. I was helping my wife with a project for her work yesterday, and she was sitting there trying to write a description of something. And I said, "Just give me your 3 bullet points. Here we go. ChatGPT done.
Yeah,
Copy pasted it, sent it, texted it to her. We were sitting next to each other at the desk, and I texted it to her. And she went, "Great, thank you. Paste done." And it
yeah.
was, yeah, it allows you to get those things moving forward significantly faster. Now, one thing that I do lament in some ways is some of the human interaction that I think we lose in some of
Mm,
the hustle and bustle of technology. I have a client who was talking about the other day that they use a sort of a meta style virtual office, but they all have avatars that they've built, and they don't use video for video calls. And the issue was they had a new employee, and she said, "I really want to see who I'm working with."
yeah,
But they've gone that step further where they've completely
yeah.
digitized their online presence. And I do think that's difficult, which is why I do love going to conferences. I think it's exhausting, but it does fill my cup a bit to be able to
Mm.
have that time sitting down with somebody and maybe not accomplishing anything in a conversation, but getting to know them and having coffee or just sharing a meal. I do think that we can't let technology forget the importance of that.
The face to face is really really important, isn't it?
Yeah. And when I think when technology becomes the barrier to relationships, then it's becoming an issue,
Mm.
which is so easy to do. It's so easy to get stuck on our phone, looking at our phone when you could put it down and talk to somebody, even if it's a
Yeah,
stranger, and just enjoying that. I think that's the difficult thing. But we're going into a whole different world of topics here.
philosophical. Yeah, but it's interesting. I mean, how do you see the American market developing then over the next 5 to 10 years, and how open is the American market to? Because you're obviously consulting a lot with companies coming in from outside to bring new ideas in as well.
Yeah. So the three previous companies that I worked with were all Eastern European based,
Yeah,
Romania, and two in Ukraine. Um, I have clients who are from Canada, which most people would say, "Oh, well, that's not that different." But there is actually a very large difference between the U.S. and the Canadian market. I have clients that I've worked with in South Korea coming to the U.S. market, and I think the biggest piece of advice that I give people doing that is your playbook that was successful, let's just use Europe, in Europe is not going to translate directly to the US market. And I've been accused of being too US centric or US patriotic maybe in the way that I view it, but I do think, and if you look at the historic, you know, acquisition price and market size and company valuation, a company that wins their market in the US does have a much easier path of continuing to win internationally, what I
Mm.
call internationally, right?
Yeah.
Overseas. And so it is difficult. There's a entire graveyard of businesses that were market leaders in Europe or in Asia that tried to launch their same service and their same product and their same language and their same team in the US market and had to leave. And so it is what I think it takes is an understanding of the nuances of the US vet market. So I think when we look at, for example, we were talking about looking at the UK for forward looking vision. I think the consolidation of the veterinary consolidators is going to continue to happen. I think we'll see, mid-sized groups being acquired by other mid-sized groups or by larger groups, which brings us to what the UK has with their 4 to 5 major players in the space versus in the US we've got 60 plus groups, and you could probably put 25 of them or 30 of them as major players. And knowing though that that's the case and knowing the nuances between those different businesses and the links that tie a lot of them together is really where I think people find the pitfalls within the US market.
I remember Tesco, which is a very successful supermarket in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
going over to America, and as you say, within a few years coming back to the UK again. So it's interesting because I think it was Churchill who said, the UK and America separated by a common language. Uh, European, obviously, we were much closer with the EU. We've now broken away from there, so it's interesting. We're sort of stuck in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean,
Mm-hmm.
a bit on our own. It's an insular type strategy, which going back in history, I remember the Monroe Doctrine, which I think was in the 1800s, very much America going for isolationism again, and that kept them out of the two world wars till a bit later when they were kind of pulled into it. But I don't think America is quite as isolationist anymore. We as an island have that within our genes, as it were, but
Yeah.
America maybe not so much now.
I do think the US market is open to and looks for the global market for innovation.
Yeah.
Um, and I think on the business side, and that's the thing that I learned the hard way in the vet space is the business mind does not always translate to success in the veterinary industry.
Hmm.
And it's very easy to look at an investment deck or look at an ROI on a product or a solution and say, yes, this makes sense. This hits on the bullet points that matter. But going back to that compassion and the passion driven side of the
Yeah.
industry, I think until those businesses show a desire to actively participate in the US market, that's where you find that disconnect. They're looking for a someone on the ground or someone that's going to go to those conferences, someone that's going to
Hmm.
participate in it and ask the questions about what matters and not give the line that I think drives everyone crazy no matter what country you're from. But if you say, well, we do it this way in XYZ,
Yes.
I think that's very tough for businesses to get over, because even if it makes business sense, it has to make veterinary industry sense as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, words that come up quite often in the podcast are innovation and digitalization. We are moving, as we said before, ever quicker down that digital path. Um, it was interesting. Yesterday, I was speaking to a vet, a non-vet, but a company called Modius that are doing all the controlled drugs
Oh yeah, yeah.
monitoring, with a digital product. where do you see that sort of going with the addition of AI? You know, I talked a lot pre-pandemic about practices being digital businesses. You know, whether you're a butcher, baker, candlestick maker, or a veterinary practice, you need to be digital. People are now starting on that journey, but I think it's still, you know, at the early adopter stage, even with some of the technologies, you know, that we see around AI for radiography and so on.
Yeah.
How do you see that going forward in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think we'll find companies that have a product that doesn't include AI, like using Modius, for example, S8, which is their controlled substance
Yeah,
logging system. Um, I think we'll begin to see a flavor of AI or machine learning or algorithmic learning or anything to that effect. Less so the generative AI, but more so the data processing component of it to
yeah,
be able to put a flag, right? It's collecting this data, it's accumulating and it's standardizing it. But then for a system like one of the Modius systems to be able to say, Dr. Chadwick, we're noticing an overconsumption of this versus historical
yeah,
data. Load this in and compare it against, you know, your PIM system and practices that have been in here versus your time clock. And hey, we're finding out that Cindy is using a lot more controlled substance than
yes,
anyone else. So let's keep an eye on what she's up to.
yeah,
So I think that's one side of it. I also, and to go back to the London Vet Show, I just was working on my presentation there. And the idea that I'm working on for that is hopefully fun. It's going to be kind of silly, but I'm going to have people jump roping while trying to type, which you can't do, but you can use an AI tool to do it.
yes,
Run on a treadmill while reading an X-ray report, which you can't do, but AI can do that. And
yes,
just showing the ways that your hands can be occupied, your feet can be moving, your body can be doing things, and your mind can be doing other things while AI is going to allow you to have either a second set of hands or a second set of eyes or process some of the mundane information perhaps that, you know, instead of sitting typing this, but your podcast, for example, I can almost guarantee that there is an AI tool that's going to transcribe this and post it, right?
yeah,
And before you know, someone would have sat there and done it. Well, it's not necessary anymore. And it allows both of us to go and do another episode or do another thing that matters. And for the same thing for the veterinarians and for the practitioners in clinic, if you're not having to pick up the phone and answer the phone, but an AI, a good AI tool, that's
mm,
the hurdle, right? Good
yeah,
AI
yeah, yeah,
can guide your clients through that intake form just using voice versus having to sit down and hand them an iPad or something. I think that's where we're going to start to see that big piece. Then the other side of it is on the business side, we're going to be able to process big data in a much more actionable way. So large pharmaceutical companies will be able to have their data analytics teams pinpoint places where they can find growth of new medicines. You'll be able to find use cases. You know, on the great side, I think we'll be able to find and identify spikes in, you know, zoonotic diseases and things like that
mm.
much faster than we were. Where hopefully we can be predictive versus reactive, and those are the places where I think it's going to be spectacular.
I think there is always two type of people: people who see something as an opportunity, and some people who see it as a threat. And people think, "Oh, we're going to lose our jobs and so on." But I think there's a real possibility for AI to be used to augment ourselves rather than to detract from ourselves. And I think you
Mhm.
presumably think
I agree.
similarly
Yeah, I
as
mean,
well.
there's also a very realistic chance that the computers completely destroy the entire Earth. I mean, they're like,
Mm.
it sounds ridiculous to say, but like, if you look at, there was a great podcast, a podcast recommendation, Foundering. That's it.
Mm.
Where the most recent season they talked about the creation of OpenAI, and the split between Anthropic and OpenAI. A lot of it was based on, and Anthropic, for people not familiar, is another competitor to OpenAI.
Yeah.
Um, but the goal there was basically the parameters around how much the tool can actually do. And the founding team at Anthropic was early at OpenAI and was said, I think we're getting too close to the nuclear option
Yeah.
here. So yeah, it's a realistic possibility, but I do think that it's something that burying your head in the sand and not wanting to participate in the tools making your life easier is, you know, like riding a horse because you think that cars are going to, you know,
Yeah.
do too much pollution. Everyone else is going to be driving a car. So you should find ways to improve the technology or iterate on it to make it more
Mm.
advantageous for your workload, while still being able to, you know, push for the correct guardrails around how you want it
Yeah.
used.
The car, of course, prevented the great horse manure crisis of the 1890s, where they thought that London and New York would be 8 foot deep in horse manure. Obviously, created another problem, which we're now starting to move out of with the electric car. But is the electric car just a small blip before we go into clean hydrogen? So the thing
Yeah.
is, it's the progression, isn't it? And I agree there are threats with it, but if good people aren't involved in it, it's much more likely to be a threat than if good people, get involved in AI and so on.
Yeah. And for specifically for the veterinary industry, I think you should look at what the team is behind the tool that you're using, right? It's
Yeah,
not just about if you want to use an AI radiology tool. I tell people that you're not going to hand a scalpel to your chatbot, right? um, but understanding, okay, here's what the tool is trained on. Here's what it's doing. Are you wanting it to do mundane tasks? Or are you asking it to do diagnosis, or are you asking it to do treatment, right? And those are very, very different things. And being aware of the limitations of current software is important. But if it can help you see something that you might have missed, or if it can process two images at the same time and compare those when you're going to be going like this back and forth, well, there's value definitely in those two
mm.
things.
Ryan, some really interesting points which I hope we can continue to discuss face to face at London Vet Show in November. Those
Of course.
listening, this is 2024 at the moment, so it's going to be November 24. If you're listening in 25 sometime, then you've missed the boat to see Ryan. But otherwise, do try and get
I'm
over to
not hard to
London Vet
find.
Show.
That's what I always tell people. And I'll be, if there's a large vet show, I'm usually going to be there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's probably very similar to yourself. There's a lot of places that people can find us.
And obviously, we'll leave details of the Bird Bath podcast and your contact details underneath the podcast and in the details and so on. But it's always good to see you, Ryan. Really
You
looking
as
forward
well.
again to seeing you at London Vet Show. And thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Well, thank you for having me. This was fun, and I could do it all day long. So thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you have a great rest of the day and looking forward to seeing you on a webinar or on a podcast very soon. Take care. This is Anthony Chadwick and bye bye.